Hello. So in this video we're going to talk about Zinnie Harris's play Agamemnon's Return, which is the first play in the This Restless House trilogy, which is an adaptation of Aeschylus's Oresteia. So Agamemnon's Return is a really interesting reworking of Aeschylus's Agamemnon, which is much more psychologically complex than the original Aeschylus play. So, as anybody who's read Aristotle's Poetics knows, one of the things that Aristotle mentions is that plot is the most significant component of a tragedy. And this is often true with 5th century BCE Athenian tragedy. What we tend to think of as internal psychological development, or what we call internal psychological development, is less significant for Greek tragedians than it tends to be for modern audiences. In the modern era, we have a concept of psychological realism, that we want characters to be fully fleshed out, and partially literary scholars argue that this partially derives from the rise of the novel, which is fundamentally a psychological genre. And so this reshapes modern theater. So, Zinnie Harris, who is very much a contemporary playwright, brings this approach of psychological drama, this modern approach to dramaturgy, to her re-envisioning of the Oresteia. So, one of the things I want to start with, I'm going to say a lot more about the psychological complexity of these characters, but actually one of the things I want to talk about is, in a way, a sort of implicit justification for the adaptation work that Harris is doing, which we get from the chorus in the opening of the play, in Act 1, Scene 1. This is a long scene, by the way. This is like 10 pages that's almost exclusively the chorus talking and giving us context, giving us backstory, describing Agamemnon murdering Iphigenia, his daughter, with Clytemnestra, which is the backstory to the Oresteia trilogy, because in order to get favorable winds to sail to Troy for the Trojan War, Agamemnon had to sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia. The version that we get here is less ritualistic than what we seem to get in ancient Greek versions of the play. Here it's sort of a brutal murder in a way that it's not a sort of formal sacrifice, which we tend to get in Greek tragedy, with everybody sort of gathered around and he has to sacrifice her on an altar and things like this. Here he holds her and he stabs her in the back repeatedly. So it's definitely less formal, it's more visceral, it's more brutal. But before that, we have a bit of meta-theater from the chorus, and we actually have what I call mythographic meta-theater. Sorry. That was my own term that I invented in an article. It draws on historiographic meta-theater and historiographic metafiction, but mythographic meta-theater is a self-consciously theatrical, hence meta-theater, representation of the narrative strategies that go into myth. So, myth is not objective. It's not, here's the myth, it's set in stone, it doesn't change. It changes always. Myth continually changes. So, what we get here is a critical awareness and a representation of the performative nature of rewriting myth. So we get the meta theater because at one point they say, "Oh, no one's leaving? There's the door. Let me tell you, this tale is not for everyone, and it's not going to be funny either. Comedy this is not. If you want to laugh, try elsewhere, we suggest." So we've got this sort of direct address to the audience. We've got generic discussion of genre. We've got an indication that the audience can choose not to watch this play. But then we've got a series of ambiguities about myth. So referring to Helen, they say, "Queen smiled too sweetly at another man. It's not the smile that mattered, but the gods had minded a smile. It's a euphemism. Screw the euphemism. You don't run off to Troy to smile at someone. She was snatched. Paris took her. No, she was a harlot, a slut. She opened her legs. She defied the rules of marriage. Let us say that." So we get here several different versions of the myth of how Helen gets to Troy. Was she sent by the gods? Did she get kidnapped by Paris? Did she seduce Paris? Did she go willingly? Did she go unwillingly? Was it innocent? Was it sexual? There's different variations, and we get those condensed here. Similarly, we get these sort of ambiguous indications of how the whole thing starts, how the whole myth cycle starts. Does it start at Troy? I mean, because the fall of Troy and Agamemnon coming home is the immediate event that precipitates the beginning of the Oresteia. Does it start with the beginning of the Trojan War when Iphigenia is sacrificed? Or does it start generations earlier with a guy named Thyestes, who was Agamemnon and Menelaus's father, I think? Grandfather, maybe? I don't remember immediately off the top of my head, but he Thyestes, Atreus is their grandfather or father, and he murders Thyestes' children and feeds them to him. And so that's often regarded as the start of the curse of the house of Atreus, which includes Agamemnon, Electra and Orestes, etc., etc. So we get all of this sort of ambiguity about myth, and that becomes a sort of interesting justification for Harris's own project of re-envisioning the Oresteia myth for her own contemporary moment. So that's, I think, a very interesting element. We get a lot of psychological complexity. I'm not going to talk about that much of it. But there's one scene in Act 2, Scene 1, where we have this lengthy conversation between Clytemnestra and Agamemnon on a hill overlooking the palace. And it's a really interesting conversation because this is one of the best places in which Harris develops these characters' psychological complexity, particularly through their internal conflicts. So, Agamemnon is sort of periodically offering to... So he makes a number of potential offers. One is to not come back to Argos at all, not come back to the palace, if Clytemnestra doesn't want to give him a chance to reconcile. He'll simply go. He also offers to live in the palace, but have them basically live isolated lives, like even putting up a physical wall between their halves of the castle, if that's what she wants. Clytemnestra has difficulty figuring out exactly what she wants to do and resolving to stick to a particular course of action. So she says, "You've spent 10 years planning what you wanted to say to me. Do you not think that I would have spent the same length of time planning what I wanted to say to you? And yet here now with you in front of me, you always confused me, even when we were teenagers. I would think one thing, then when you were there, the softness is easy, it seems, now in this moment. I would only have to half close my mind and look at you broken and desperate, and I could take you in my arms. Of course I could. I love like of course I could. Love like we had doesn't die. But this other flame, this vengeful spirit, this other voice that leads me on, he killed our daughter, he killed our daughter, he killed our daughter." So we get these conflicts. I mean, her internal conflict basically centers around that. On the one hand, the love she has for Agamemnon and the desire to reconcile with him. And on the other hand, this bitter hatred and this sense that any sort of forgiveness is a betrayal of her daughter. So this is central to her conflict. But it's a long conversation, and it goes back and forth in really intricate ways. But Agamemnon repeatedly emphasizes how much he's suffered from guilt, from regret, from angst over the 10 years, how much he's missed her. He says, he explains himself that he did it only because the gods demanded. He sacrificed his daughter only because the gods demanded it. And that he wants her forgiveness. And she points out to him that he doesn't need her forgiveness because the gods demanded it, and so in his eyes he's already justified. But he wants her forgiveness specifically, because her opinion is the one that he says matters to her. So a lot of what he's saying is the sort of ethically right things. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hurt you, I had to do my duty, I've suffered for 10 years because of it, etc., etc. But we also get these moments, like, he says, they haven't decided yet whether or not they're going to publicly reunite. There's the expectation that that's what they'll do, that's what the crowd of Argive citizens wants them to do, but they're not sure that they're comfortable doing it. And so he says, "We will disappoint the crowd, but so what?" She says, "The fucking crowd." Agamemnon says, "The thousands that have traveled." So I read this at least as a passive-aggressive attempt to guilt her into taking him back. So we get some complexity here. He's not a sort of simple, straightforward, repentant guy. And the thing is, she is convinced to let him come back. But then she sees this charm around his wrist, this bracelet around his wrist, and asks where he got it. And he sort of tells this story about, I've had it for 10 years, it's supposed to bring me luck, etc., etc. I can't remember who gave it to me. And she comes to realize that this is because he at one point says it might have been a woman, and she puts two and two together and realizes that he has not been sexually faithful to her during the Trojan War. He's a Greek hero, so in reality, there's not that much expectation that he would be sexually faithful to her, because that's what Greek heroes do. They go out on epic journeys or whatever it is, and they have sex with a bunch of people. In the Odyssey, Odysseus spent of his 10-year journey home, he spends 9 years having sex with a nymph. So the standards are not really high here, but when he's basically just spent this whole lengthy scene telling her about how sad he's been, how angsty he's been over the course of the Trojan War, and she now realizes he was out having sex with Trojan women, it doesn't sell it for her. And so there's that tension, that complexity is central to the play. The ending is interesting as well. I mean, it ends largely the way that Agamemnon ends in Aeschylus. Clytemnestra murders both Agamemnon and Cassandra, the Trojan priestess that he's brought back as a sex slave. But there's some interesting differences. So Cassandra, I think, is one of the most fascinating characters in Greek tragedy. She is a prophet of Apollo who has been cursed that she will always see the truth and reveal the truth via prophecy, but she'll never be believed. She's a fascinating figure. In this play, she narrates for the chorus the murder of Agamemnon, which is really interesting because in Aeschylus, Cassandra is in the house with Agamemnon when Clytemnestra murders her, and when Clytemnestra murders him, and Clytemnestra murders Cassandra at the same time. So, for whatever reason, Clytemnestra in this version has dedicated herself to not killing Cassandra, just to killing Agamemnon. And so Cassandra is alive and outside, and she gives us this detailed description of this sort of seduction murder that that Clytemnestra carries out. In interesting ways, even echoing the chorus's description of how Agamemnon had murdered Iphigenia. So that's a really interesting thing. Like this idea of the victim misrecognizing what's going on as some sort of game until it's too late. That shows up in both. But then, so like I said, Clytemnestra's bizarrely set herself against the idea of killing Cassandra. And after she murders Agamemnon, she goes over and says to Cassandra, and look, I have the blood of one on my hands, not two. I changed my fate. I have free will. And then the stage directions say Cassandra shows she has been gashed and is bleeding from the belly. So at one point, Clytemnestra was like flailing the knife around, trying to get the chorus to back off so she can murder Agamemnon. And she catches Cassandra with the knife. She doesn't realize she's done it. She hasn't intended to do it. But she did. She inadvertently kills Cassandra. And this is a really big deal for her. Like, when Aegisthus shows up, who otherwise has no real role in this. Like, in Aeschylus's version, Aegisthus is her lover and has been for years, and they plot the whole thing together. Here it's not clear exactly how much of a role he had in plotting it, but he's clearly there as the sort of backup. Like, if she fails to murder Agamemnon, Aegisthus will show up and do it. And she says to him, I shouldn't have killed her. I was not supposed to kill her. Aegisthus says, it doesn't matter. Clytemnestra says, I wanted it to be different. And that's interesting. What does that mean? I wanted it to be different. Is that another mythographic meta-theater moment? I wanted this version of the Agamemnon not to end the way that Aeschylus's version did. I wanted this version of the myth to be different. I don't know. It's an interesting line, but she's really, really obsessed with this idea of fate and changing her fate, and that idea tends to run through other examples of mythographic meta-theater. This idea that you can rewrite your mythic destiny is central to this genre.